Thank you to a whole raft of our staff and our volunteers, including some of our board members and advisory council members who are here as volunteers. You can tell us, because we're wearing this tag, if you need something, find somebody with a lanyard. They can point you in the right direction. They can help you out. You know, since 1974, VPAS has been providing services for older adults and their caregivers and their families. And over the years, those services expanded and grew. And for several years, we talked about the need to support caregivers. And we talked about it. And we talked about it. And the pandemic gave us laser focus. And in conjunction with our board of directors, in our new strategic plan, caregiver support is a pillar of that plan, and we have greatly expanded our services to caregivers, and we have plans for much more. Just after the strategic plan was adopted, I became a caregiver myself. And last spring, my caregiver responsibilities significantly increased. And I learned the truth of something that a very wise person told me. It's much easier to talk about caregiving than to be a caregiver. So today, I hope that you who are walking this path with me will leave with new knowledge, new ideas, new contacts, maybe with fellow caregivers. I hope that you will feel uplifted and feel for yourself the respect and value that all of us feel for you as we walk this path together. So I'm about to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. He gave me the introduction and said, no edits. So here you go. Ron Culberson ranks in the top 30 of his wife's favorite speakers. He worked as a hospice social worker, a middle manager, and a director of quality improvement at Hospice of Northern Virginia. Ron was also the 2012-2013 president of the National Speakers Association and was inducted into that organization's Hall of Fame. From a creative perspective, Ron has written 4 books, produced hundreds of blog posts, and co-produced 2 children. Please welcome Ron.
Thank you so much. Good morning. So this chicken walked into a library one day, walked up to the librarian and went, book. The librarian looked down and said, you want a book? And the chicken went, book. So the librarian gave the chicken a book. The chicken left the library. 10 minutes later, comes back in the library, puts the book up on a counter, looks up at the librarian and went, book, book. The librarian said, 2 books? The chicken went, book, book. So the librarian gave the chicken 2 books. The chicken left the library. 10 minutes later, comes back in the library, puts the books on the counter, looks up at the librarian and went, book, book, book. Well, at this point, the librarian knew the routine. So the librarian gave the chicken 3 books, but decides to follow the chicken out of the library, across the street, down a hill, and watches as that chicken takes those 3 books and puts them on the ground right next to this big bullfrog. Bullfrog looks down and goes, read it, read it, read it. I know what you're thinking. I left the house for this. So 20 years ago, my father-in-law told me that joke, and I looked at him and said, that is the stupidest joke I have ever heard in my life. And I just didn't think twice about it. And at the time, I was speaking a lot within hospice circles because I was a hospice social worker. And I was at a hospice conference, a national hospice conference. And I was at a table at dinner one night with a bunch of my colleagues who were also in hospice. And I just decided I'm going to tell this joke. So I told the joke, and these people fell out of their chairs. And I thought to myself, I have underestimated this joke. And I will tell you, one of the greatest points of my career was that I got to tell that joke in front of 800 librarians. I will never pay a late book fee. So why would I start with such a stupid joke like that? Here's why. I think we need to just lighten up a bit. Would you agree with that? I think right now in this time in history, we need to lighten up. It has gotten so heavy in the world. I mean, let's not even consider what you personally are dealing with if you're an active caregiver right now in your caregiver roles, but let's just talk about the world and how heavy it is. So I think we have a hard time right now not being overly serious. But I also have a theory. I think as we get older, we get grumpier. Would you agree with that? Yes, a couple of you shaking your head no. That's because you're the grumpy ones. You just don't, you don't get that, see? Yeah, see, I think this is the trajectory. This is the path we're on. I think we start out and we go through like adolescence, early adulthood, and we're wide-eyed, bushy, everything's a possibility. And then as we get older, we get grumpier and we get cynical. My wife and I laugh. We live in a community where most of the folks are older than us. And we look at these Nextdoor apps and these other things where people post comments. And I said, it seems like people are just sitting in their living room, looking behind the curtain, going, what are they doing out there now? And I said, we don't want to be like that. We're trying to fight that tendency to complain too much or just to focus on the negative. But I want you to understand something about that. Being negative or being overly serious is not something that we just randomly choose to do. We are actually designed that way. And we're influenced that way. So it's not something that comes internally so much as something we want to do. It's actually, we're put on that path. And let me explain what I mean by that. So neuroscientists have determined that we were actually hardwired to be negative. And the way this plays out is studying how the brain works. We know that back in caveman days, if a caveman walked out of his cave and saw something life-threatening, his brain immediately says, well, this can't be good. And so the negative response in the brain was life-saving. But that's not today. We don't walk outside your house and immediately see something life-threatening most days, right? So to always be looking at things and saying, this can't be good is not helpful to us because it puts us in a negative mindset. Then we start seeing everything as negative. So we have to understand that we have a natural tendency to go down that path. So if that's the first thing. Second thing we need to understand is that we're influenced by the culture. You only need to spend 5 minutes on Facebook to see how much negativity is out there, right? But I mean, it's everywhere. We're influenced everywhere. I mean, you look at the news, you listen to the news, you watch the news. I did an experiment one time. It was not a formal research study, but I had about 100 people in a room at a conference in a hotel. People were sitting at round tables, and I just decided to pass out a bunch of newspapers. By the way, you have to explain to young people what newspapers are. But I passed out a bunch of newspapers, and I said to people, what I want you to do is I want you to go through these newspapers, and I just want you to keep track of what are positive articles and what are negative articles. And let's just look at it. So everybody did that. We then tallied up the results up front on a flip chart. Do you know what the average ratio of negative to positive was? 30-1. So think about this. On a daily basis, if you're watching the news, you're listening to the news, you're watching Facebook or whatever, you're putting 30 times more negative information into your head than positive. Now, I'm going to tell you, I was a psychology major, I was a social worker. There is no way that can't have a negative impact on you. It influences you when you're exposed to that over and over and over. You start to see the world like that. But here's the bigger problem. We like to out-negative one another. You ever notice this? Somebody comes up and goes, man, I've had this headache all day. I had a headache for 7 years once. Where does that come from? Right? I used to have a Harley Davidson motorcycle. You know what happened if I told somebody I had a motorcycle? They wanted to tell me everybody they knew that had been maimed on a motorcycle. I don't need that information. That's not helpful to me, but that's what we do. That's the natural tendency. So we have to fight that natural urge, and then we have to fight the influences from the culture. So you can see it's already an uphill battle, right? And then the worst of it all is that we were brainwashed as children. And y'all did it too. Y'all did it to children as well. Now listen to me, think about this. Go back with me for a second. When you were a child, and you were in class in school and said somebody laughed at the wrong time, or you were at the dinner table at home and somebody laughed at the wrong time, or Lord forbid, you were in church. Did you see how I whispered? I don't know why I had to whisper that. If you're in church and somebody laughs at the wrong time, there were these little phrases that adults said to you about laughter or about what your behavior was like. What were some of those phrases you remember adults telling you? Shh, be quiet. What else? If you made a face, people said your face is going to freeze like that. You know, I've looked into this. There's no research to back this up. What else did they tell you? You ever remember this one? That's not funny. A child is laughing. Clearly, it is funny, right? Or they tell you, this is not the time or place. Ever tell you when or where? No, just not right now, not right here. Or please grow up, or act your age. Finish this one. Wipe that smile. We all heard this, right? And I love the one about your face will freeze like that. I heard a teacher one day, she called down a little girl in her class because the little girl had made a face. And she went up to her and she said, you know, when I was a little girl, my mother told me if I made a face like that, it would stick. Little girl looked up and said, well, you can't say you weren't warned. So here's the problem. Here's the problem is we got the wrong message growing up. We were told that we had to stop goofing off, stop being silly, act your age. And inevitably what happens then, and not intentionally, but this is what happens, is we got this message that adulthood must be about seriousness then. You're supposed to be serious when you get older. And that's what happens then. And so we grow up thinking, if I'm going to be a successful adult, I better be serious. I better be serious about this job. I better be a serious parent. And see, the problem with that is the goal in adulthood is not seriousness. I'm here to tell you that that is definitely not the goal. The goal is excellence. The goal in your life is to be good at being in your life. Whether it's your work or your personal life, the goal is to do a good job. That's what we all want when we get to the end of our life, is to look back and say, hey, I did a decent job. But it's not seriousness. And I'll tell you something funny. If you want to see where this plays out in real life, watch what happens if somebody gets promoted to be a supervisor for the first time. Oh, they change. They're walking around like this. And you go up to them, you go, why are you holding your face like that? Because I'm a supervisor now. You're like, well, you look constipated. That's not a good look. That's not the way a leader needs to look, right? So I think we need to understand first and foremost that we're in a battle right now. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm right here with you. We are over the top of the hill right now. I'm not saying we're on the downslide, but we're over the top of the hill, which means we have 50 plus years of this as habits, right? I'm 61. My habits are 61 years old. So if we've been looking at the world like this and doing things this way, we got a long way of habits to try to reverse. But I don't think there's ever a time where we can't. I think that's the beauty of life, is we are always given choices and we're always given options about how we do things. So I want to share a story with you. I'm a big believer that stories are the metaphors of our lives. They're the things that teach us things. And when we're going through our life and we have an experience, and it's that experience that you tell at Thanksgiving, or you tell your family, or you tell your friends after it happens, when you look deep into those things, there's actually meaning and truths in those experiences. And that's kind of neat. And when we learn from that, we see that life's teaching us something, right? So this story I'm going to share with you is my belief about what I think life is all about. It's a metaphor for what life's all about. So I grew up down 81 in Southwest Virginia. There's a little town down there. Interestingly, we're in Bridgewater. There's a little town down there called Emory, where Emory and Henry College is. They play Bridgewater in football. I was the ball boy when I was a kid for Emory Henry College. And I just think this is so cool to be here because it's related to where I grew up in a way. So Emory, without the college there, is only 280 people. So it's a very similar town. It's a very similar environment to this. It's a rural environment. And when I was 13 years old, my mother came to me and said, we're going tubing down the South Fork of the Holston River. Now, that was the largest river nearby. And so how many of you have been tubing down a river? Let me just see by show of hands. All right, most of you. Few of you have not been. So let me explain this process. You get the inner tube from a tractor tire. You inflate it. You sit in it and you ride down a river. That's pretty much it. So my mom comes to me and says, we're going tubing. I said, I don't do tubing. She said, what do you mean you don't do tubing? I said, I'm not going tubing. She said, why? And I said, well, first of all, I don't know what's in that river. There are snakes, there are snapping turtles, there are things that live in that water. I don't need to mess with those things. Why would I put myself in that situation? And secondly, I saw the movie Deliverance. I mean, come on, I grew up in that part of the country. When I was a kid, my dad said, if you're out in the woods and you hear banjo music, you need to run home as fast as you possibly can. So I thought to myself, this sounds like a miserable outing, but it was a family outing, and you know how those work. I had to go. So we get down to the river, and you know the routine. If you've been, you get down there, and there's always that big pile of inner tubes, and you've got to pick an inner tube that fits you. Well, when I was 13, I couldn't find an inner tube that fit me because I only weighed 65 pounds soaking wet. I was chiseled, but I was only 65 pounds. Now, why is that funny? So anyway, I'm too skinny for this inner tube. So every time I try to sit in it, I just slip right through the middle. And every time I did, I kept thinking, that's too much of me below that inner tube. That's like bait. So I get myself as best as I can balanced on this thing, and we shove off in the water. Now, the first thing we hit was a series of rapids. What causes rapids? Rocks. So essentially, I'm just bottoming out over and over and over. And I felt like I was hitting every rock in that river. And I'll tell you something, I got home the next day, and I got home, I was so sore from those rocks, and I'm a little embarrassed by this. I was so sore, I actually took a mirror out and checked my backside, covered in bruises. And it did occur to me, I could have called social services. And if I had, I would have had them place me in a non-tubing family. That's what I should have done. Well, we got through the rapids and I survived, so that was all right. Then we hit what was the nightmare to me. The worst part of the whole trip was when we hit the slow part of the river. Because why is it slow? Deep. It gets deep, it gets slow. Now, you know what the water's like around here. We got all this red clay in the soil. It's muddy. It's not clear water. So I'm in this deep river, cloudy, can't see a thing. I'm barely moving, and I am convinced that I am completely surrounded by things that at any minute are going to come after me, and I am terrified. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. And then we went around the next bend, and we went around the next bend in this river, and there, directly in front of me, was a dead pig. A dead pig that apparently had been there for quite a while. Because as my brother said, that dang thing had swelled up. Now, I got to tell you, here's the irony of growing up in Appalachia. None of us question, why is there a dead pig in the middle of the river? It's like when you're walking through the woods and you see a car transmission laying there. They're native to this region. We've seen it our whole lives. We don't question it. But the first thing I realized when I saw that pig was that the current was taking me right towards it. And my first reaction was involuntary, but we were in the water, so that was all right. My second reaction was to realize that my entire psychological well-being was going to be dependent on me not hitting this pig. I'm thinking, if I hit this pig, I'm going to be the guy at future family reunions where people just gather off to the side and go, you know, he weren't right ever since he hit that pig. I'm like, I don't want to be that guy. Well, so I had been to summer camp, so I knew how to swim a little bit. So I just employed every technique I knew. I started thrashing in that water. I was like the Appalachian Michael Phelps. And I got myself away from it, went around it, and then I went off to the side of the river, and I actually got out of the river. I'm standing on the bank of the river, and I look back to see if anybody else is back there. And there's one person still in the water behind me. It's my mother. Now, my mother at the time was in her 50s and didn't know how to swim. I have no idea what she was thinking getting in a river, but she didn't know how to swim. So since she doesn't know how to swim, she doesn't know how to maneuver herself in the water. So she's at the mercy of the rapids. So she realized that, saw that pig coming at her, and just started screaming. She is screaming so loud, birds are flying out of the trees. Now, I'm way over here. I can't do anything. She's too far away. And so I had to just stand there and watch the whole thing unfold. And I stood there and watched as my mother hit the belly of this pig. And somewhere on the pig, I heard, but here's the thing. It was so tight, she ricocheted off. She hit it, she bounced off, come flying across the river right there, landed on the shore right next to me, hopped out of her inner tube and said, let's go, we're leaving. I'm not making this up. We walked 4 miles down a dirt road to get to some car to take us back to our own car because neither one of us was putting one toe back in that water. Now, I said I'm 61 years old. I've never been tubing since. I mean, tubing makes me nervous. YouTube makes me a little nervous. And until the day she died, my mother died at the age of 94. Until the day she died, if she even smelled bacon frying, she'd break out in a big rash. So what would this have to do with you? What would this have to do with caregiving? What would this have to do with the way we live our lives? I think everything. And here's why. I think that river is a metaphor for how we go through life. First of all, there are rapids, right? There are rapids. You can call it whatever you want, stress, adversity, challenges. There are rapids in our lives. Assumingly, you're here at this event because you're a caregiver or you're in some role to be a caregiver. That means you are dealing with some rapids, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. I don't think we like to deal with rapids, and yet rapids are part of the trip. You know, it's part of the journey. When I worked in hospice care, I found that the people who we serve, the patients we serve, the ones that said things like, this isn't fair, I shouldn't have to go through this, were the ones that had the hardest times. The people that I served that would say things like, you know, this is not what any of us would have wished for, but we understand this is how life works. They got through their circumstances easier. It's as if we went up to the river and pointed to the rapids and said, that's not fair. It's not fair or unfair. It just is. It's part of the journey. So I think our bigger challenge in life is not to try to avoid adversity. It's to realize we're always going to have adversity, but let's figure out how we'll deal with it so it doesn't get the best of us. So we're always going to have the rapids, but then there's also the slow part of the river. And this is the part that I think is most neglected. Metaphorically, I think the slow part of the river should represent the time in the journey where we kick back and enjoy the ride. You know, this is where we're supposed to notice. Today, I'm driving up 81, and this is one of the most beautiful days we've had recently, right? The temperature was wonderful. The sky was blue. The sun's coming up over the mountains. If you don't notice that, and instead are worrying about something, you're missing a gift that's given to you right then. So I think the slow part of the river is the idea that we should be enjoying our experiences when we can. Now, I live about 30 miles southwest of Charlottesville. I live in the Wintergreen community down in Stony Creek, rather. It's in Nellie's Ford. I live in the woods. I come out of my house every day and I'm completely surrounded by natural beauty. But I'm afraid one day I won't notice, that it's just going to be so normal that I won't notice anymore. And this is the part of the slow part of the river. Because when we're in the slow part of the river, what are we usually doing? We're complaining about the rapids we just went through, or the ones that are coming, and we're missing where we are right that moment. And so when I walk outside the door of my house, I never want to miss where I am right that moment and look around and take it in and experience it. So I think that part of the river is telling us, be present, be aware, enjoy that part of the journey when you can, because that's what balances out the rapids. Now, the pig, the metaphor of the pig, I don't know. Just don't hit it. That's all I can tell you. But here's the greatest lesson I learned as a hospice social worker. One day the river ends for all of us. We do not know when, where, or how it will end, but it will end for all of us. And because I worked in that environment, here's what you're going to do. You're going to get towards the end of the river and you're going to look back over your shoulder and you're going to ask yourself how the journey was. That's not the time to determine you should have done something differently. And I can tell you that as a witness to people who discovered it at that point. Now, while we're on the journey, is the time to make adjustments, to tweak things, to do things a little bit differently. So when we find ourselves at the end, we can look back with a sense of satisfaction. And that was my experience. I had the great blessing at 25 years of age to work in a hospice setting. And you know what that did for me? It put me in a situation as a young person beside people at the end of their lives who would tell me what they learned. And so I had the privilege of being able to go into life with some of that understanding. But most of us never have that. We have to figure it out along the way. So when I started thinking about this, as I started my career, I did my graduate research, by the way, in social work school on humor. I studied the benefits of humor. And so I started doing some presentations on humor and laughter and the benefits of humor. And then I started realizing that when I looked at the way that I'd done my own life when I was in a job or when I was in a volunteer role, I realized there were two things that stood out to me. One was I always tried to do things the best of my abilities. I always wanted to do a good job, whether it was a volunteer job or a paid job or just being a member of the community. I wanted to do a good job, but I also wanted to have fun. I think somewhere along the way in social work school, somebody taught me that, nobody's gonna do it for you. You got to figure it out yourself. So I always wanted to have fun along the way. And so this concept of do it well, make it fun came to me. This idea of how we go into life with this filter on that says, how can we either do things better or make them more fun? And let me explain why that's an important concept. First and foremost, everything you do is a process. Right? Everything you do is a process. Think about this event right now. At some point, you found out about this event. And from that point to right now, you engaged in a process to get here. It wasn't a very complicated process, but you engaged in a process. You had to decide to come. You had to figure out what you needed to do to register. You had to get here somehow, and then you end up in your seat. So everything's like that. Everything in our life is like that. And so when we start thinking about our lives as processes, what that then leads to is the understanding that processes are made up of steps. So if you want to change something in your life, you want to change something because it's not satisfactory to you, you got to break it down into steps and figure out how to affect the steps. And each step has the potential of being either better or more fun. So years ago, Volkswagen had this theory that if they made things more fun, people would do things that were good for them. So this is one of the first viral videos on YouTube. It's called the Volkswagen Fun Theory. And what they did was they went to a subway station in Stockholm, Sweden, and they went to a place where there was a stairway next to an escalator. And they turned the stairway into piano keys that actually played when you walked on them. So it was like walking up a piano. And they had set up cameras to do a before and after comparison. And so when you watch the video, you'll see things like this. You'll see somebody start to go up the stairs, and then they'll look over and see that start to go up the escalator. They'll look over and see the stairs are pianos, and they'll go up that and just play the piano as they go up the stairs. Or you'll see somebody going all over it, trying to play a song on the different stairs like this. Or you'll see a little kid just jumping on one key like this. And then at the end, what they tell you is when they made the comparison, when the stairs were more fun to take, 66% more people took the stairs. Now, I don't think that's rocket science. I don't think anybody would dispute that. We all understand that. If stuff's more fun, we're more likely to do it. So then why don't we spend more time making the yucky stuff more fun? We don't think about it. We don't think about it as it applies to our lives. We just acknowledge it when it happens. So I'm a big believer that we can carve out things and we can change the way we do things to make them more fun so it gives us balance or to make them better. So my example of that is cooking. How many of you like to cook? I like to cook. Okay, a number of you. I'm a hobby cook. And what I mean by that is that I never was formally trained, but I cook all the time. I cook 99% of the time at my house. And When the Food Network came out in the 90s or wherever that was, I was all over that. I loved it. And I loved learning and I love cooking. I love trying new recipes. Here's why I don't like to bake. I hate baking. It's too precise. You know, 1/2 teaspoon off and everything's just shot. So I don't like that. But I like cooking because in cooking, you can play around with it, right? If you take a recipe, what is a recipe? It's a series of ingredients and a series of steps. And if you start messing around with any of the ingredients or the steps, the outcome's different. And that's fun for me because I might want to tweak a recipe. It's too spicy or there's too much cream in it or something about it doesn't taste right. So I can change a step or an ingredient and I get a different outcome. That's it. That's the way our lives are. We can change an ingredient or step and the outcome is different. But here's what I think most of us do. We just go into life on autopilot. We're just sailing along. We're not thinking about what we're doing. We're just doing. And then all of a sudden, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, we're going, what was I thinking? I wasn't paying attention. You know, and I've encountered so many people at the end of their lives that said, I wish I'd done more of this, or I could have done that, and I just chose not to. So it's a matter of along the way, how do we do that? So I want to share with you 2 ways to do this today. The first way is going to be managing your stress. Caregiving is stressful, right? Caregiving is stressful, 24/7, and you never know what to expect, and it is tiring and it is stressful. So let's just acknowledge that right off the bat. All right, so I'm gonna give you one technique to manage stress that I think can change the game a little bit in how we deal with stress. And then the second thing is, how do we deal with all we have to do? How do we do with just our daily tasks, our daily lives, and how we manage that so that we can, that we can get through this process with a little more balance and not be so serious all the time. All right, let me just get a sip of water here and we'll go on. So let's talk about stress a minute. Here's what I know about stress. Stress is not automatically stressful, right? Things are not automatically stressful until we decide to make them so. So here's what I know about this. If things were automatically stressful, everyone would experience the same stress in every situation. And since we know that doesn't happen, it has to be something that we're doing to either make it stressful or not. And so I suggest that probably 80% of the stress in our lives has nothing to do with what's happening, but everything to do with how we see what's happening. And you know how I know this is true? Because every single one of you in this room has somebody in your life that if you see them coming, you get a knot in your stomach. You start getting worked up before anything's happened, right? So what is that telling you? Nothing is going on and you're stressed out. It has to be up here. It has to be up here. It has to be the way you're seeing it. So I think one of our big challenges is to figure out how we change this rather than trying to change everything in the world or all the things that might be creating stress. And once we change this, we can then manage anything. If you can manage your stress, you can handle anything. And it's not going to take a toll on you. So let me give you an example. So I told you I grew up in Southwest Virginia. I married a woman from Long Island, New York. I don't think I need to tell y'all, I was nervous about that wedding. I was nervous about these 2 families getting together. These are 2 very different families. And so we had designed the weekend. So the weekend we got married, Friday at 4:00 in the afternoon, my family was going to drive up from Southwest Virginia to Long Island and meet her family. All right. And so it would be that first time where these 2 families get to see each other. And then later that night, we had a rehearsal for the wedding, like 5:00, I guess it was. And then at like 6:30 or something, we had the rehearsal dinner. And then the next morning at 11 a.m. was the wedding. So that was all the activities for the weekend. So it's 4:00. I'm at my future in-laws' house on Long Island, and I'm waiting for my family. They're not there. Got to be 4:30, 5, 5:30, 5:45. They're still not there. And we start talking about, wonder what happened. And then we realized what had probably happened. My family was driving up that day, and they had timed their trip so that they hit the outskirts of New York City at the Verrazano Bridge at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Does anybody by chance grow up in the Northeast up in that area? All right, so you all know, in the summer in New York, everybody goes out to Long Island for the weekend because that's where the beaches are. So you have this mass exodus out of New York City going out to Long Island, which is what my parents are going to be getting into. Now, my parents did not know traffic. I mean, the biggest traffic jam my parents had ever encountered was 4 people getting a 4-way stop at the same time. And because they're Southerners, they're stuck there for 20 minutes because everybody's going, no, no, you go ahead. No, 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 you go ahead. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. And let me just be clear, I was in New York not long ago. Nobody looked at me and said, go ahead. So I thought they're going to get into this mess. It's going to be awful. I'm thinking they're going to drive up there. They're going to see a big sign. It says Long Island left, and they're going to go home. That's right. Some of you get that later. That's fine. That's a whole nother theory of humor we're not going to get in today. Well, they got there about 6:30. We missed the rehearsal that day. The pastor said to us, just do your best. That was the rehearsal. So we went to the rehearsal dinner. That went off without a hitch. That was fine. And then we went to our hotel that night. We were staying in a Ramada Inn in Hauppauge, New York. Hauppauge was 30 minutes from the church. And so I was spending the night that night with my best friend from college. He was in medical school at the time. And so we were sharing a room. So we got into our beds that night and turned the light off. And then we realized we'd left the curtains open because you could see the parking lot lights. So he goes, get up and close the curtain. I said, all right. So I went over and I closed the curtain. And when I did, the room just went pitch black because it was those rubber back curtains, you know, that just block out all the light. So I turned around. Now I can't see to get back to the bed. And I said to him, you're going to have to flip the light on because I can't see to get back to the bed. And so he flipped the light on. I'm walking back and I said, man, that was dark, wasn't it? And I just made this off the cuff comment. I said, what if it was so dark in the morning I didn't get up on time? Don't get ahead of me. I didn't think twice about this. I did not think twice about this. I slept like a baby. I slept so good that night. And I woke up to a noise. Have you ever awakened and you know something, there was a noise, but you don't know what it was? So this noise, something woke me up. So I'm looking around the room. I can't see anything. It's pitch black. So I turn the light on. And as my eyes are adjusting to the light, I see my buddy Dave just walking around the room and he's moving things off of tables and he's shuffling things. I'm like, what are you doing? He said, I don't think we got our wake up call. I'm looking for my watch. And I was like, oh, that's all right. My watch is right here on the bedside table. I picked up my watch, 20 of 11. Now we're 30 minutes from the church. The wedding's at 11. I'm going to tell you something. I came out of that bed so fast, my underwear stayed in the bed. I got on a new pair, though, because they weren't usable anymore, if you know what I mean. So I am not making, I ran out in the hallway of this hotel in my underwear. And I'm just running going, help me, somebody, help me. Because we had this block of rooms. I thought, I'll just get somebody, send them ahead, tell them I'll be there. There's not a soul in the hallway. It's just desolate. And then I realized, well, they're gone. They would have gone a long time ago. So that put me in another level of panic. So I got all nervous. I ran back in the hotel room. I went in the bathroom. I turned on the shower and I thought, I don't have time for a shower. And this little voice in my head said, man, you're getting married. I think you have to take a shower. Have you ever been in a situation where you're so stressed out you can't make a decision? So I'm standing in this bathroom. I'm going, shower, no, like this. And I can't stop. And about that time, my buddy Dave walked in. As I told you, he's in medical school. He'd just gone pale at this point because I think he thought I was going to have a heart attack. And apparently they hadn't gotten to that chapter yet. So he grabs me by the shoulders and he holds on tight. He says, calm down, settle down. He said, it's only 7:30. I set your watch ahead. They never found his body. Now look. So at the time, I did not see the humor in the situation. In hindsight, very funny. At the time, not so much. Why? Why did I not see the humor situation? Because my mind immediately went to the point that my life is over. My wife is not, she's going to think I don't want to get married. She might possibly just pick somebody else that's there. I thought, this is it. I'm done. You know, and I got all worked up thinking how bad this was. Whereas in reality, worst case scenario, what? Call them. I'll be there. I'm going to be about 20 minutes late. That would have been the worst that would have happened. But I was in a different state of mind, and I created far more stress for myself than I had to experience. Now, this is what I think is interesting about stress. Hans Selye, back in the 40s, 20s through the 40s, was studying stress, and what he found out was our bodies don't know the difference between real stress and perceived stress. So the real stress would be, yeah, you're facing a tiger in the wild. That's real stress. But perceived stress is the stuff we come up with in our head that we make up, but it still affects our bodies the same way. You know, when you watch a gazelle being chased by a lion, the gazelle goes into that fight or flight mode. They just take off running, right? The minute there is no longer a threat, the gazelle's body immediately goes back to a normal pace, a normal status. Whereas we hang on to it. You know, we hang on to it, and we talk about it, and we relive it, and we reimagine it. And that just continues the process on our bodies and can work us out. I mean, wear us out over time. I remember Viktor Frankl, who survived a concentration camp. Viktor Frankl said, the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. In other words, the greatest freedom we have is to choose our attitude and how we're going to deal with something. And I just got to say, if you look at social media today, people are not making the right choices in their attitudes. I don't have any issue if you disagree with something I've said or have a different perspective, but there's just no reason to go into attack mode. We never discuss anything anymore. It's just one side or the other, and we're butting heads. That's because people are choosing to have that kind of reaction. Now, I don't know about you. I don't like to be in that state of mind. I don't like to create a situation where I have more stress. I don't like to create a situation where I create more stress for other people either. So I'd much rather, have a discussion about it. And that's a choice in how we go about that. So one of the things I think is most important, and this is something I think is especially true in caregiving, is this concept of being present in the moment. There are two realities that we have in our lives. One is the real reality. This is what's happening right now. And the other is the reality in our head that's telling us what the reality is. And it's not always the same. And so I think one of the things we have to do is practice. And if you read mindfulness literature or you look at things that teach us about being aware or being present, essentially what it's just saying is just be in the moment and see what's actually going on rather than being in your head and living in your head all the time. So I'll give you an example of this. So I started studying this stuff about 15, 20 years ago, mindfulness. I really wish that this is something we were all taught when we were young, because I think if we had spent a life developing it, we'd be better at it at this age. But the idea is that we get out of our heads and just be present in the moment. So I'll give you a quick example of that is, if you're sitting there right now and you're thinking of something you have to do when you get home, or something that's stressful for you, or something on your mind, you're not being present. You're being present to your mind. You're not being present to what's going on right here. And you're missing a good presentation. But that's a whole other. But you see what I mean? It's like we'll sit here and then our minds will take us down a path and we'll be way over here. After 5 minutes, we're worked up and nothing is happening right now. Nothing right now is happening for any of us that we have to attend to right this moment. And that's the real reality. But the reality in our head will take us a different way. So when I started reading about mindfulness, one of the things it talked about is don't multitask. That there's no real thing as multitasking. You can't really do two things at once and really focus on either. And the easiest example of that is you're ever on the phone with somebody and you're trying to do something else while you're on the phone. What do you inevitably do during the call? What was that? Because you missed something, because you weren't focused, right? So they said, do one thing at a time. So for instance, they said, if you're going to go out on a walk, let's take that as an example. You're going to go out on a walk. Don't put music in your ears. Don't do something else while you're walking. Don't make a phone call. Just walk and be fully present in the experience of the walk, the physical part of it, the sights, the scenes, the smells, the sounds. And it will change that experience for you. So I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I'm going to try this. And I'm not making this up. First day I did it. I used to listen to podcasts or I'd listen to music while I was walking. I didn't take my earbuds with me. And so I just walked. And as I said, I live in the woods. So I'm out the driveway and up the hill. And all of a sudden I hear something in the woods right next to me. And I turn and there are 10 deer standing there, about 20, 30 feet from me, just going like this. And we looked at each other for about 30 seconds. And then one of them snorted and they all ran off. But if I'd been listening to my music or a podcast, I would have never heard the noise in the woods. I would have gone right past that. And you take that and expand it bigger. That's what happens in life, right? Where did the time go? Because we weren't paying attention at the moment. And so I think this is something that can be one of the greatest lessons as you're a caregiver and as you're going through that day that is so stressful, you go anywhere. You all are of the age, you remember Calgon, Take Me Away, right? But in that day, there are going to be moments where if you're present and experiencing it, it's not going to be stressful. But we sometimes just gloss over and we don't get to experience it. Now, here's the other great benefit about being present in the world, being present in our lives. That's where humor lies. Humor comes from seeing things by paying attention to things that are out there already that we may have missed if we're just in our heads and we just go right past it. There's humor everywhere if we're paying attention to it. And the more humor we get in our life, the more it teaches us to see things from a different perspective, the more balance we can get in our life, and it helps to manage that stress. So what does that mean? It means look for humor. Because if part of managing stress is to change the way we look at things, the very nature of humor is that it changes the way we look at things. For instance, a joke changes how you see something. You have a setup and you have a punchline. The setup goes one direction, the punchline goes another direction, and all of a sudden now you see the original premise differently. For instance, this three-legged dog walked into an Old West saloon and said, "I'm looking for the man who shot my paw." I heard somebody groan. Somebody groaned. That's all right. Listen, I'm an expert in humor. I know what that means. When somebody groans, I can guarantee you within 24 hours, they're going to repeat that joke. They're not fooling anybody. All right, let's break this down. What's the joke mean? Paw. Paw takes on two meanings. It means father, Old West paw. It means the paw of an animal, right? So what? Who cares? Because now you have two different perspectives on the same situation. Part of managing stress is to be able to see things differently so we don't see the stress in the first place. So here's what happens neurologically. When you start seeing more and more humor and you start reading more humor or watching more humor, exposing yourself to more humor, your brain's neural pathways start to change and they start to influence you to start seeing things differently. And the best thing about humor is the more you see, the more you'll see. It reinforces itself. So just start looking for it. Now, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's obvious, but it's not always obvious. So let me give you an example of both, obvious and not so obvious. I was in Oklahoma City for a speaking engagement a number of years ago, and I had checked my bag when I flew in there. So I went to the luggage claim area to get my bag. Now, you all know what this is like. There's a conveyor belt that comes out of the wall, and then it usually does a big loop, and then it goes back in the wall. So you stand there and wait for your luggage. So I'm standing there, and I see a suitcase goes by, another suitcase, a woman's bra, another suitcase. And then right there on the conveyor belt, all by itself, no open luggage anywhere around it, is a woman's bra. Now, I don't know what your first thought would be. My first thought was, how does that get there? I mean, I'm not an engineer. Can it just pop off? I mean, how would it get there? And my second thought was, and who's going to pick it up? That thing went round and round. Nobody touched it. Then it went behind the wall, didn't come back out. Now I'm thinking, what's going on behind the wall? I mean, it's obvious. That's obvious. Everybody standing in that baggage claim area was laughing. I told everybody I knew that day, you won't believe what I saw at the airport. It's obvious and it's funny, and we got to enjoy that. Just be in the moment and enjoy it. Secondly, it's not so obvious. So I was down in Charlotte, North Carolina a few years ago. I was speaking at a conference. It was a group of nurses. And I drove to that event because from my house to the hotel was only 4 hours. And so I drove to the event. It was in a Hyatt hotel in downtown Charlotte. And they had a parking garage in that particular Hyatt. And the parking garage had 4 levels. You had P3, P2, P1, and BM. The top level of the parking garage was the BM level. Now, what planning committee would get together and say, what do you think we ought to name the parking garage levels? And somebody goes, well, I think BM would be good. And everybody goes, yeah, that's great. And of course, when I got there, it was all backed up. And but so here's the point of this, is that I went into the room the next day with 70 nurses. And I was introduced, I walked out, and the first thing I said to them was, where'd y'all park? And they all went, parking garage. I said, what level? And they all burst out laughing. But I don't think it registered till right there. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think they went by, they probably wrote down the level, but they didn't think, oh, that's funny. And so they didn't see the humor until it was pointed out. So this is the problem that we've got. This is one of those problems. You know, we've been trained to be serious. We're not looking for humor, but it's everywhere. Just look for it everywhere. And then when you start looking for it, you're going to see it. And that's going to give you some benefit. If nothing else, it gives you a millisecond of break from your stress to laugh a bit, but then it also helps those neural pathways to change things. So 2 principles when managing stress. 1, change your perspective. Don't let your head get the best of you. See if you can see the situation in a different way and just be present. And secondly, use humor to help with that process, to keep you in the moment and to be present in the moment. Now, lastly, just as we wind down here, I want to talk about real briefly here. I want to talk about how do you manage the actual work that you have to do? And when I say the work you have to do, I'm just talking about you have things you have to do throughout the day. How do you manage that? Because most of us, our to-do lists are longer than we'll ever do. I was just listening to a podcast the other day that says nobody ever does their entire to-do list because it just constantly expands. And so the minute that we can just accept the fact we're never going to get it all, that in and of itself relieves us of some stress. But anyway, so how do you do this? Well, I think what I like to do is I like to look at the processes that I've got to engage in. And if any of them are either boring or stressful, I try to change the way I do them. So that makes the process not so taxing on me. So I'll give you a kind of a different example, a volunteer example. I don't know how many of you have ever served on a church committee. But the first church committee I ever served on, I went home that night and said to my wife, those can't be Christians. It was just the most contentious group of people arguing about everything. And I thought, oh my goodness. But here's the thing. I'm good at committees. I'm really good about being on committee. I'm a good committee member. And then, so what happens if you're a good committee member? You become chair of the committee. And then you become chair of the next committee. But that was my course. And I don't know why I'm good at it, but I just am. So I get all these opportunities. So a couple of years after that committee, I got elected. I'm Presbyterian. I got elected to the board of deacons in my church, which were the social workers, basically. You know, we're sending flowers. We're going to visit people in the hospital and all this kind of stuff. It was a 3-year term on this committee. So I go to my first meeting. It's a Monday night, starts at 7:30 p.m. It ends at 10:30. Now, I've worked all day, and I just went to a 3-hour meeting. Now, I don't mind 3-hour meetings if that 3 hours is productive. But this is what those 3 hours were like. We were having discussions about, do you think we should put the greeting cards on this shelf over here? Should we move them over here? And I'm like, I can't take 3 years of that. So I went to the next meeting, and I said to the chairperson of the committee, I said, put me on the agenda. I've got a proposal for you. So he put me on the agenda, and at the end of the meeting, he said, what's your proposal? I said, here's my proposal. If you can finish this meeting in less than 1 hour, just once, I will dress like Vanna White and bring you a dozen roses. You see, back in the day, I used to dress up like famous people. I'd dress up like Elvis, James Brown. I'd dress up like And at the time, Vanna White was the most popular person on television. So I dressed up like her for a skit we had at our hospice. I was Vanna White. So I had the outfit. Well, when I said I was going to dress up like Vanna White, these people on this church committee looked at me like I had two heads. And then they became possessed with getting that meeting done in less than an hour because they wanted to see me go through with it. Well, that meeting went from 3 hours to 2.5 to 2 to an hour and a half. The closest it ever got was an hour and 5 minutes. Because if it looked like it was going to be something close, I'd throw out something controversial. I mean, I'm no idiot. I don't mind dressing like Vanna White, but I'm not paying for roses just to get a meeting to end early. Well, here's what interesting thing happened is that over the course of 6 months where they were really working on this, the meeting got down to about an hour and a half. And for the rest of my 2.5 years on that committee, it was an hour and a half on average. In other words, what we realized, we weren't doing the meeting well. So if you go back to that concept of do it well, make it fun, we weren't managing our time well. So once we buckled down, we realized, oh, we can do this better and everybody's happier because we're out of here earlier, right? So that was a way of doing something better. Then how do you do something with a little humor? How do you manage something with a little humor? I have a friend who's a Presbyterian pastor. He's retired now, but he was up in Arlington, Virginia, and he used to come over to our hospice. We had a nice cafeteria, and he would eat dinner there some nights when he had to stay late. And we got to strike up a conversation. We got to know each other a little bit. But he was telling me one time back in the day, and I don't know if it happens today as much as it does back then, but there were all these telemarketers that would call, and they always called during dinner. Now, the way he knew it was a telemarketer was his last name was Atwood. And if they said Mr. Atwood, then he would know they didn't know he was a pastor. And so it was probably telemarketing. So one night a guy called and he says, how are you tonight, Mr. Atwood? And he said, well, you know, I woke up this morning and I had this twitch in the back of my lower back. It was just, you know, kind of right where it goes down your back and kind of into your hip. And then it started radiating, and it started radiating through my hip and buttocks. And it was very hot. You know, it just got to be hot. And then I could feel it down my leg. And then as it got to my foot, you know, I had that toe fungus. And so it started to aggravate that a little bit. And then he said he heard click. So that's how he now deals with every telemarketer. He talks till he hears the click. And I thought, that is brilliant. And he has a good time. He's not hurting anybody's feelings. He's not offending anybody, but he's getting out of that situation in a fun way. And I think this is what it's all about. This is how we do things. When COVID hit, this is what I do for a living. So when COVID hit, my calendar cleared because people stopped having conferences and meeting in person. I did some virtual things, but so I had this free time on my hands. So in 2020, in the summer of 2020, I had already been a volunteer ambulance driver for Wintergreen Fire and Rescue. I became an EMT. And then this past year, in December of this past year, I started a firefighting class. So in April, I became a certified firefighter. So I'm now a 61-year-old EMT and firefighter. I'm having the time of my life. But when I became an EMT, I have to watch my mouth because I think of funny things, and sometimes it's better not to say it. And I was with this woman one time. We picked up this woman. We think she might have broken her hip. She's in a lot of pain. But when we got to the hospital, but she was wearing a nightgown when we picked her up in the ambulance. So she's wearing a nightgown. And when we got to the hospital, you have to take the sheets off and everything, and then transfer her over to the hospital gurney. And while we're doing this, the whole time she's just tugging on her nightgown because she's modest. She doesn't want anybody to see, and she's pulling her nightgown. And so as we lifted her up and she's tugging on that nightgown, I just leaned over to her and said, "Don't worry about it. It covers more than Medicare." And she burst out laughing. And I'm like, I was so grateful that she laughed. But I have to feel like in that millisecond of time, that made her situation that much better. It didn't fix anything, but just for that second. So if we can try to make our lives, no matter how stressful they are, I can guarantee you, if you focus on the stress, it's going to be stressful. That's pretty much the basic principle. But if we can find other ways to look at it, it won't be so much. So I'm gonna give you one more example today, and then we're gonna wrap up. But I just want you to understand that this do it well, make it fun philosophy is really about putting things through this filter and trying to figure out how to maneuver in our world a little bit differently, so that when we go down that river, we get back to and look back over our shoulder, we see that we do have some satisfaction. Two things I want to tell you. Some of you may have gotten this form when you came in the door. The bottom part of that form is a subscription form for our blog. We send out our blog, and it's about once a month. We don't market, we don't advertise, we just send our blog out. So if you'd like to get that, fill that out and leave it at the table in the hallway. I'll be here through lunch today, or at least through the first part of lunch. And also, I'm selling books out there, copies of my books. And if you're interested in getting them, just know that 25% of the sales goes back to Valley's program for senior services. So, so you're supporting this very organization that provided this today by doing that as well, because we feel very privileged that we were able to have the opportunity to be here. So we feel like that should benefit them as well. But let me just share with you one example I think is probably the most profound example I ever heard in my hospice experience. It kind of ties all this together and shows you sort of how I think we need to go through life. One patient I had in hospice, and just so you know what my role was, I was a social worker. So that meant I had to go out and do a psychosocial assessment and provide psychosocial counseling to patients and their families. So my whole goal was basically, how are people coping? How's their support system? How are they financially? It was just sort of that, everything that was non-medical, except for the spiritual stuff. It was the non-medical stuff. And so I would go out and do an assessment, and then I would determine what support they might need. So I went out to visit this woman. I'll call her Mary. That's not her real name. I'll call her Mary. And I walked into Mary's room at her house, and she was fully dressed. She had her makeup on. She had her hair done. She's in bed, propped up there. And I thought, look, she has done this for me. She has gotten ready for my visit. And I was very honored by that. And so I sat and talked to Mary for a little while. And then I talked to her husband, and I talked to her 2 daughters. And what I realized instantly was Mary was the reason this family was so strong. She was the rock of this family. She and her husband had this wonderful relationship. Her daughters had grown to be responsible women on their own and had wonderful families and were active in the community. And you can trace it all back to the person of who Mary was. So I left that day and I thought, it's going to be sad when she ultimately dies, but she's pretty much prepared them to be able to cope. I'm totally convinced that they didn't need any kind of supportive counseling. About 2 weeks later, the nurse that was working with me, with Mary and her family, called to say that Mary had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. They did not think it was related to her illness. They thought she might have had a reaction to a bit of medication, or she might have an infection that could be treated. So at Hospice of Northern Virginia, where I worked, we had an inpatient facility. So we brought Mary into the inpatient facility just to monitor for a couple of days to see what was going on, with the plan that we'd get her back home. So I happened to be in the building the day she came in. So I went to see her. I walked in her room, and instantly I could tell there was a change. The color was gone from her face. She seemed to have a little bit of trouble breathing, and she just looked weak. You know how when somebody's weak, they just kind of sink into the bed. And I walked over to her bed, and as I walked to her bed, she opened her eyes, saw me coming, held out her hand, and greeted me by name. She had met me once, and she called me by my name. And I took her hand, and I sat down on the bed next to the bedside chair beside her. And I said, "How you doing?" And she goes, "Not good." And I said, "Well, are they getting you everything you need?" And she goes, "Oh, they're spoiling me." She says, "They bring me things before I know I need them. They're anticipating my needs." And then she raised up on her elbows, and she was so weak, she was kind of trembling. She raised up on her elbows, and she took this long gaze around the room. She said, "This place is gorgeous. It's just beautiful and so comfortable." She said, "I'd heard a lot about it. I was dying to see it." She fell back on her pillow and burst out laughing. She's like, "Can you believe I said that?" And I'm sitting there thinking, what's the right social work response to this? I don't even know what to say. So we just enjoyed a moment of laughter. Just laughter. We didn't have to analyze it, didn't have to talk about it, just enjoyed it. 6 hours later, she died. And I will tell you, it was one of the most profound experiences of my life, because she exemplifies do it well, make it fun. She did her life very, very well, but she wasn't going to miss an opportunity to laugh, no matter how dire the situation was. So when you hear that story, what I want you to think about is, as you're going through your caregiver roles, no matter how challenging it is, there are these moments that are there for the taking if we can just see them. And when we grab those and embrace them and experience them and be present in them, that's what helps us to keep going. And I will tell you, from a professional perspective, you are the most significant people out there helping care for people in the community. So we need you to keep doing this. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'm so glad you get this day out to replenish yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron. That was a wonderful, wonderful way to start our day. I just want to let everybody know that we're getting ready to start our breakout sessions in just a couple of minutes at 11:15. And so you have the schedule in your blue folder, but you will pick one of the three. And just to let you know, breakout session 1, Navigating End of Life with Dr. Caldroni, is just down the hallway, and follow around. There are signs at the door. There are also room hosts that will direct you. The second breakout session, Taking Care of the Caregiver with Sabrina Burris, will be right here in this room. And I would encourage you, if you're going to stay for that, maybe just move down a little bit closer as you are comfortable, so everybody can be together. And the third session